Bonsai friends. This is Evan Pardue of Underhill Bonsai, and welcome to episode 21 of Little Things for Bonsai People, formerly Bonsai Southeast. This time I'm joined by one of my co-hosts, Carmen Leskobiansky.
You got my right.
Yes.
I'm so proud of you. Have you been practicing?
No, it's just it's one of those things where I'll say it, and this time around I got to it and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to say it like I don't care. Like,
I'm so excited. Good job.
For the scoreboard. Like, how many episodes has it been? Like, probably 6 or 7. That's Evan 6, Leskobiansky 1. Wait, I don't know.
I think it's the other way around.
Yep. Leskobiansky 6, Evan 1. Yeah.
I think you have 2 now. She said it right twice so far on this episode.
Or more, I should say, like long English words. Actually, what is that last name? What's the origins of the last name? I'm sorry.
Czechoslovakian?
Okay. Yeah. Czechoslovakian names versus me. And also other long English words. Anyway, how are you feeling today, Carmen?
I'm feeling pretty good right now.
Yeah, I'm glad I could make that really ridiculous and over the top for a second there. But today we're going to be discussing bonsai forms or styles. We're going to be revisiting our little series that we've started, and today's form is going to be the clump style, or Kabudachi. Kabudachi. I'm just going to make sure I say it right. In Japanese dialect, it would be faster than that because there's no pauses. So Kabudachi. Or when that translates back over to English, it goes to stock stand. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more once we get to it. But then we'll also do a little bit of discussion on species specific trident maples, and might even talk about Japanese maples a little bit. We love both of those species and they're great for the clump style. But before I get started with that part of the podcast, we do need to mention that our podcast is sponsored by our amazing patrons over on our Patreon. We call our $5 tier patrons Bonsai Best Buds. We currently have a good handful of them. Thank you guys so much for supporting. Special shout outs to Tori Solis, Warehouse Rat, Boy Snellgrove, Ricky Ruins, Joshua Bentley, Snappy Chappers, and Ryan Goridano. I'm sorry if I messed up your name, but now we're going to have a competition between me and that name, apparently. Thank you so much.
Give him 6 or 7 episodes and he'll get it right.
Yeah, give me a good while. Give me till the next time we revisit. Wait, that's just going to be next week. I'm totally screwed. But anyway, thank you guys so much for supporting the show and being a Best Bud, a Bonsai Best Bud. You can go over and be a Bonsai Best on our Patreon page / Little Things for Bonsai People. And we're supposed to be collecting birthdays, but I need to go into, I need to either start up a Discord and get everybody to just kind of tell me when that's coming up. But I'll just go ahead and say happy birthday to everyone whose birthday is today, especially our supporters. Awesome. Anyway, so if you want to also support or follow me and Carmen and Mike on our social media pages, you can go to underhillbonsai.com for me. I have articles that I've written in the past about bonsai techniques and my little ventures in bonsais that I have. We have Facebook and Instagram. You can go visit there and subscribe there. Carmen, she is one of the co-founders of the Purple Pot Society, purplepotsociety.org. Go over there, check it out. Full of information. It's the Women's National Bonsai Club, and it's only $35 to be a member for the year. What a steal. All kinds of great content, especially for anyone who wants to see that whole world of women's bonsai art. And then we got Mike Lane. He's currently out teaching bonsai, I'm assuming. So you can go over to Kitsune Bonsai and you can check out his information. He does private workshops. He goes to people's houses, maintains private collections, does some really awesome stuff. He just came back from India. We mentioned this several podcasts because it was a big deal and he was gone for a little while, but we'll get Mike back hopefully next episode, but he's been really busy. But if you are just listening, that's awesome. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you go over and subscribe, follow us on your favorite listening platform. We have reached a great number of following subscribers now. We have 50 people. Thank you guys so much. I don't know where all these subscriptions are linked to, but appreciate it. But yeah, let's get into the main topic, which is clump style or Kabudachi. It's a style or form. I know I was leaning kind of into talking about style versus forms. And the last time we talked about this with the informal upright. And the reason why I want to say that is because I was supposed to bring a book with me whenever I was visiting Carmen up at the Cartigas Bonsai Garden. And it was World Styles of Bonsai, I believe. Do you remember?
Yeah, I remember.
Bonsai Styles of the World by Charles Ceronio. And that's an excellent book. I think it just got reprinted recently. And this is kind of like the companion to what we're doing here. I think I should probably start referencing it more and get some content from that. Might even try to reach out to the author. That would be a really cool little thing to do.
Yeah.
Good friend of mine showed me this book, and I was like, this is actually really cool because it breaks down all the styles into their subcategories of how each of them could be done differently. Because even though we're doing, like we had mentioned with the informal upright, even though we're doing your typical, here's the Nabari, here's the Takagari, where it comes up to the first branch, and then it goes over and it sweeps to whatever direction, and then the crown will land right back over the base. That can be done in so many different styles and so many different ways. There's no one way that can be done. And I think clump is a very unique style as well, because, when we think of clump, what do you think, Carmen? Clump it's really hard to explain.
Yeah. I usually think of multiple trunks, but it can be, where was my brain going? I definitely think multiple trunks, but there's not really a way that they have to be situated necessarily. It's not a full on forest. That's different, but it doesn't have to necessarily be like slanting or broom style. There's not really one way to do a clump. It's just you have multiple trees kind of put together. So I don't know if that was helpful.
It's helpful enough. And you mentioned just a second, just a little bit earlier, forests. And so clumps are not necessarily forest plantings.
Right.
Would you say?
They're
more, there's a reason why they're called a clump. And I think there's two versions of it. I don't know if this would be considered, would you consider this style that's sometimes called turtleback? Have you ever heard of that before?
Mm-mm.
Turtleback is in reference to, let's say you took I think one of the better candidates for this is like a crepe myrtle, for instance. Mm-hmm. If a lot of people are familiar with crepe myrtles, Lego, Lars Strodium. But the tree, sometimes those crepe myrtles will grow into just a massive literal clump of trunks and stuff. And so they get this big giant knot or this swell at the bottom. And then what can be done is all those trunks be cut off and you have this ball mass of what the trunk was. And you kind of carve it in literally into what looks like a ball. And then when it suckers off of that mass, it makes what sometimes is termed as a turtleback.
Okay.
So it looks like a island or a turtle. You ever heard the lore for, I'm not sure what lore it comes, might be Chinese lore, the turtleback islands. It's literally a gigantic turtle.
Yeah. I think there's some indigenous cultures in North America that have a similar mythology. I think I've seen that. We do that a lot with Coreolopsis and some ilex. So yeah, that's Right. Yeah. There's different ways to have a clump because I'm also thinking of how we have chojubai clumps, which are
Mhm.
also very different than like a Coreolopsis or a maple clump, but they're all technically clumps. So
And
yeah,
Coreolopsis, that's
winter
what's
hazel.
winter hazel. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a species that I don't get to see a whole lot, only when I'm up in the Pacific Northwest with you guys.
Yeah.
If you guys are not familiar with that, Coreolopsis winter hazel, and it's just to learn from me too, because I love knowing the Latin names. But
Yeah, it's they're blooming right now. Andrew Robson has a really nice one. I think that's one of the ones that won at the Pacific Bonsai Expo.
yeah, go over and check out Pacific Bonsai Expo and go look up. Jonas has got a great blog. I mean, his blog is just great regardless. But
Mhm.
he's got a good coverage on that show, and that is a yellow flower, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
a little yellow dangly thing.
I might have to contact Andrew and see if I can use that tree as a thumbnail
Mm-hmm.
for this episode because that tree is gorgeous.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's a great representation of a clump, and I think it is kind of like a tortoise back looking clump. Like it is comes out one giant base.
Yeah, it's that
And
one big knot with all the multiple trunks coming out of it.
yeah, and it should be distinct that it's not a broom style, which
Right.
could be confused for that.
Mhm.
And where do you draw the line at broom style versus clump?
I always think of a broom style. It only has one trunk, so that's what makes a broom style for me. So a clump can still have that kind of overarching, roundish, full canopy like you would see with a broom style, but because it has multiple trunks, I would not consider it a broom.
Yeah, so the single trunk on a broom, that's a really great point. That's something that I feel like kind of blurs the line between a crazy looking broom style tree versus a crazy looking clump. Whereas, yeah, like that broom needs that distinction. It has that elongated section of the trunk that comes up clearly above the trunk line. I mean, the soil line up to it is a trunk tree. Whereas a clump can kind of get away with there's an abari and then suddenly multiple branches that look like that are acting like multiple trunks instead really draws that line between clump and broom. But I've seen some really low broom styles that if you air, that's one of the things I think is really funny is you're like, man, that's a cool broom, but if you air layered it right there, it would be a great clump.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where it comes from. And then I know with clump style too that it's not necessarily always a tortoise back.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, and you guys have this up at the garden where you're at, is it's a bunch of Japanese maples sometimes, and they're just planted in really close proximity, and they're just trimmed where the fusion happens.
Right. Yeah.
Can you tell us about that technique a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do this. Sorry, there's a cat in my bathroom and it's going bananas right now. So if I'm distracted, that's why.
No, it's okay.
She's literally bouncing off the walls. Oh my God, what is she doing in there? Sorry. Okay, you can cut that part out too.
No, just leave that in. What is the cat's name
There's
again?
a psycho cat in my bathroom. Does anybody want a cat? I have an extra.
What'd you end up calling the cat?
Rosie.
So y'all gonna keep him?
Oh no.
Oh, okay.
I haven't had time to place this stray that's been living in my bathroom for 2 weeks, but she's very cute when she's not jumping off the walls.
Yeah, she seems kind of young, but anyway.
Anyway, yeah. So Japanese maple clumps. So there's a couple of ways that we do these. There's here mostly what we're doing is air layering off like a section of a Japanese maple stock plant where there's, like at a branch intersection where there's 2 or more branches coming off of a trunk. So we'll air layer that and then grow out the roots, to create a nice nabari. So it's multiple trunk, but it's all one piece. There's other ways that you can do this where if you just take seedlings and plant them in really close proximity, eventually they'll fuse together. And that takes a little bit longer for that to become one solid clump, one solid massive tree. And I think that's really where it gets confusing between is it a forest or is it a clump? Um, but you can do it that way too.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways to make these like connected root system type styles, and that's a couple of good ways there. And I know, would you consider a raft like there's raft styles?
Mm-hmm.
So where's the difference between raft and clump? And I did notice that
raft versus clump versus forest. Yeah, this is it's really hairy.
It's a little confusing. Yeah.
I think a raft I consider like a branch that has ground layered itself. So I don't know that you necessarily would be able to tell. I think that some, like if you think of Dave DeGroat's like rainbow arching raft, that's like a very obvious raft. It's all these trunks off of one branch that's like could have been ground layered by itself. But if that branch were in contact with the soil the whole length of itself, you might think of it more as a clump. But I think maybe a raft, you can tell that it's all these trunks off of one solid piece of wood, that maybe there's not as much variation in where they're placed in the pot. Like maybe it's a little bit straighter because they're all attached to that one same piece. So I think it can get kind of difficult to identify the difference between a raft versus a clump versus a forest, but depending on how it's presented and how it's styled and what you know about the tree.
Yeah. Rafts, I think from the way that I've been taught with that is that it should be literally all the trees feel like they're on a raft together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's long and usually there's kind of like, it goes into this other style called cineous root, which is kind of like a raft, but it's where the tree is allowed to run suckers to the point where they start developing a long root system. And so when I think raft, I think like the bigger tree was formerly the first strongest branch on the tree before it fell over.
Yeah.
And then the preceding branches are kind of like the smaller ones. And then maybe the ones on the ends get bigger again.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some variation in size there.
Yeah. And
it's like, if you can imagine one of those big oak trees, with the lowest branch that's gotten really heavy and has fallen to the ground and has rooted itself and kind of like goes up and down with all these different branches kind of coming out of it. If you can picture that, that's kind of what a raft should be.
Yeah. And like touching down branches, like you'd mentioned Dave DeGroat's Beijing kind of style that he did with the bridge thing. That's really cool. So yeah, and another thing to be known, the reason why we're talking so much deeper into all the styles versus each other is that when you get a piece of raw stock or bonsai, pre-bonsai plant that there's something going on and you would like to start developing it towards a particular style. Even having like the book I had mentioned earlier, Bonsai Styles of the World, you're like, ooh, this kind of looks like a clump. And then you can flip to the page in that book where it has clumps and it can show you all these variations. And maybe your tree is a certain species, or maybe it has its own growth habit that's unique to that plant that you need to focus in on and make it a feature. And a lot of the time with clumps, the feature, I mean, this is kind of how sometimes we look at some trees like Carmen had mentioned earlier, ilex, which is holly.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of holly varieties are used in clumps because they are shrubs. So that's simple. I see, like, for instance, the ilex that grows here, the Yopon holly, especially the really amazing dwarf Schillings Yopon that we have.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some clumps. I think they're okay as clumps. They're not deciduous. They don't really make a lot of features. Like, what's that ilex that's at y'all's garden up there? What was that one?
There's serrata and there's reticulata. So there's like a North American winterberry and then a Japanese winterberry.
Okay.
They're
So
very similar in habit.
those winter berries, they will literally make red berries without leaf, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And so features like that also elevate clump styles. Features of deciduous nature or fruiting or berries, like we had mentioned earlier with the winter hazel, makes a beautiful yellow flower. We have a species indigenous to our southeast area, the huckleberry, makes a great clump because it makes the white berries and white flower, bellflowers, and then the blueberries. Basically, it's blue. It's a wild. Oh man, blueberry Latin name.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh man,
I feel like an idiot. I always know this one.
it's very straightforward. Y'all have one blueberry. Is it a B?
A V, I think.
Oh, a V, vaccinium.
Vaccinium. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, for a little while, it was such a silly Latin name to me because it looks like vacuum. So it's like vacuumium. I'm like, what is this?
Vacuumium.
Vacuumium. Yeah, that's a really cool Latin name, but it's vaccinium. But yeah, there's a lot of vaccinium. A lot. There's a lot more than I thought. There's, at least where you guys are at, I think there's a good handful of mountain ones.
Bunch. I love vaccinium. That whole genus is really cool.
Yeah, I think there should be more vaccinium bonsai out there. I've seen some production vaccinium blueberries that are bonsai. Is that a wild one that y'all have?
I think that's a wild one, but I know people will just buy production ones. You just have to wait a little bit longer for them to look old.
Yeah, the wild ones, I mean, they can be magnificent clumps. I mean, great clumps, and they can have skinny trunks, and that's not a big deal as long as they get good movement. And then the feature of the fall and the berries that come and the flowers are just so awesome. So yeah, I think clump style, I think a lot. Clump styles are great, but they are not for every species. So we had spoke about informal upright on the previous forms and styles series episode we did. And we were saying that just about everything is good for that. But what do you think is more clumpy in your opinion? I think we've named off quite a few good ones, but are there any other ones you can think of?
I think when you mentioned something about most of these plants being shrubs, I think you were really onto something, because a lot of these are really difficult to grow as single trunks, like trying to grow a blueberry as a single trunk, or a Coreolopsis or a holly or a chojubai. I mean, how often we've got, I don't know, one single trunk chojubai here and one double trunk, and literally everything else is a clump. Because it's a shrub and that's just how it grows. You just grow it into a clump. So I think shrubs make really, really good material. But even within shrubs, you don't always see people, like azaleas technically are a shrub, but you don't usually see a lot of, well, I take that back. You see some shrubs, oh my God, words are hard. You see some clumps with azalea.
That's what I was going to ask you, is one of the things with azaleas, I don't see a lot of, like every once in a while I'll see a clump looking forest hybrid azalea. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. But
yeah, it's weird. You see more of them over in Japan, I think. I think Americans are still really stuck on the whole big trunk sumo style thing. And azalea is a shrub that you can really do that with, and you can kind of produce a really thick trunk pretty fast. But being a shrub, a lot of times you hear folks having the top of their azalea die back, and that's just part of its nature. So growing an azalea as a clump would work really well, probably. I haven't personally done it yet, but I will be. I've worked on some that are clumps, and they're pretty nice. So that's a good one.
With azaleas, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Carmen.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting that we started talking about maples as clumps, and they make good clumps. But it's funny, that's a tree that we turn into a clump when there's so many shrubs that just naturally want to be clumps.
And I mean, I don't have a definitive answer for that, but why do you think that?
That we turn it into a clump.
Yeah, why do we choose like trident maples and Japanese maples to be clumps sometimes?
I think because they fuse so well, and I think sometimes maybe it's you're trying to make a forest, but it fuses, and then you just end up with a clump.
And you just like whatever, yeah.
I think because they're fairly easy to make, and they grow pretty quickly, and um, they're a little bit. I think they're easier to take care of than some of the shrubs, which tend to be really picky. But Japanese maple and trident maple are really kind of straightforward trees. They're hard to. They're pretty easy to keep alive.
Yeah, and I think
a lot of dieback and all that.
One of the things that kind of contributes to it, was like I mentioned earlier, is they have a deciduous nature, and getting a clump with lots of intricate trunk lines and a really interesting base that's fused together, and then you get on a lot of Japanese maple varieties, beautiful early spring, some flowers and seed pod stuff going on, and it gives you kind of like clumps don't necessarily feel old. Like sometimes they sometimes they can feel really old, given like the tortoise shell shape ones that looks like an old tree that has just multiple stories of ecosystems that have stacked into that one structure kind of feel to like when you're in the deep valley kind of wooded hardwoods kind of area, and you see that big tree that's just something happened to it and it's either died or candelabra. And that's another style that's very distinct. Candelabras are not clumps either, but they can fool you sometimes. Giant branches that come down and pour out and come back and turn into trunks again. So that can be a very old feeling style, where some clumps feel like dense, younger, middle-aged forests. But the fusion of the roots adds an interesting factor to it. So, yeah. I was going to ask you something about azaleas before we got too off topic from the shrubbing versus the deciduous guys, and guys or gals, because bonsai have feminine and masculine qualities. But whenever you're dealing with an azalea and you're doing trunk removal on like maybe a big shrub that you might have obtained from a garden center or maybe dug out your front yard. Is it true that if you cut down sections of the azalea too fast, it could cause root dieback as well?
I think I've heard that before. I haven't experienced it because I haven't really gone that far on an azalea trunk. But my understanding is that if you have something really well established and you cut off a big branch or large parts of the tree, that you could kill off a root zone, because the root is directly feeding that portion of the tree. And I think that can happen in stuff like junipers too. So yeah, I've heard of that happening.
Yeah, because I was thinking about some stock. We have Suzuki Wakabishu. Or is it Shinzen? I think we have Wakabishu at the nursery currently. We have like almost 100 of these little tiny guys. They're not really big. And I'm just wondering like how many of those trunks would be safe to take off versus what the root mass is. And then it's difficult to see because they get so dense. And then I try to dig down and find where that root base or even where the nabari would even start developing. And I'm just seeing trunks and it's all just matted roots. Yeah. So it's challenging. I'm going to have to go
one like that too. It just looks like all these different stems coming out of the ground and I'm not really sure where the root is.
I mean, maybe you just grow box it until you see that root base become obvious. Yeah. I mean, that's totally possible.
I mean, if you're going to do a real big cut, do it in the spring or summer when it's actively growing, because you'll have a better chance of it, budding back and not just dying. If you do a big cut in the winter or in the fall, you're way more likely to lose that whole branch or that section. So anything bigger than like your pinky finger, do it in the growing season, like after flowering or whatever.
And we're going to do a whole thing on azaleas later on.
We're
But so
getting
I
close to
don't.
azalea season. Woo.
When is azalea season again?
Like May, June.
Okay, so we'll aim to do it then. But yeah, there's a lot of questions I have about azaleas that I know you know a lot more about because of your work over at the university with
Mhm.
those beautiful trees. So yeah, we'll revisit it on another day. But let's talk about trident maples and maybe a little bit about Japanese maples too, because they kind of go into this clump style thing very nicely.
Mhm.
And like you mentioned earlier, you can find decent stock that could be fused together by putting into like an Anderson flat,
Mhm.
or you can find seedlings and just start them with the. I've seen like the tourniquet technique. That's something that you experimented with, but
Mhm.
tie them together and just see what happens.
Yeah.
Sometimes a few of them die. The trident maple is a little tricky in that regard. I mean, they can swell really easily, especially if you're
Mhm.
trying to keep thinner trunks. So how do you combat that in the early stages of development of those trunks then, of that clump, do you think?
I think you just have to really keep your eye on it. If you're doing kind of the tourniquet method or tying trunks together, they're going to swell and they're going to swell fast. So use something that's a little bit stretchy or revisit it pretty frequently and loosen up your your tourniquet a little bit so you don't get a weird bulge in there. Um, because yeah,
That
they'll move pretty quickly.
that's one of the things I kind of remember for a second. We're talking about tourniquet style. That's where you take little young seedlings and then you put a tourniquet. So that could be anything from like a piece of bonsai wire, which is usually not recommended because that won't stretch.
Mm-hmm.
What do you? And the reason why we're doing that, just before we get too far into this conversation about tourniquet style is or development style, is that we're tying these trunks together in the hopes that they'll fuse together nice and their
Mm-hmm.
roots will appear to be one. And then as it cuts in, the trunks are going to get bigger. And so whatever you use to tie those together, that's going to need to be either flexible or it's going to get eaten by the root mass. Because we want to go back and chop off the stuff below the tourniquet, if I'm saying that correctly. Is that what you have experienced it?
Oh, I think I'm thinking of something a little bit different where you take like a handful of trunks or a couple trunks and you do like an inch worth of like buddy tape or floral tape and get all three trunks to like fuse and then you can place the roots wherever you want them around. So it's like creating just one big trunk with a spread of roots um, without necessarily having to cut it off. But just with the other tourniquet method you're talking about, you can do that too. Um, yeah, so either way, something a little bit flexible is going to be helpful.
Yeah. And that method that I was mentioning is something that's a little bit different. I've seen some people take like seedlings and put their taproot through like a washer with a decent size, somewhere between like an inch or so that the nabari, the surface root of it, will be more apt to spread laterally,
Yeah.
easier, and then it has an obvious part of where you could cut that tap off.
Yep. Yep.
So that's part of it. And then when we're talking about multiple trunks,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen people. It's a thing that kind of happens too. It kind of girdle the trunks together is a terminology. So intentionally cut into them. Usually, girdling is a bad thing in bonsai because when I think of girdle, I think of when you wire a branch and the wire cuts in. Cutting
Mm-hmm.
in is bad, but it's bad enough that not only does it cut in, but it cuts in across the grain of the wood and across the sap line and could sever the branch.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're doing with that technique as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything else to add to that?
Not really.
Okay. Yeah, the buddy tape is actually awesome idea. I mean, I would only be worried about the trunks just growing too fast and then like biting
Yeah.
into it. That's why you said to watch it a little bit.
Yeah. If you're trying to connect a bunch of trunks together that way, that's something that you have to be real careful about, or you're gonna get a big scar on it.
Yeah. I mean, obvious things like, and also if the tape is on too long,
Oh yeah.
would it cause like it would also kind of cause a swell, but it could also cause the wood to be not as strong or resilient. Maybe that like the outside bark. Is that something?
I think probably more so than that, you're gonna run into like a reverse taper issue, where you might have to cut it off above, where that fusion is, because the tape will, cut into it so much that there's a swelling above that. So it becomes a tourniquet instead of just something holding all your trunks together to fuse.
Yeah. And once you get fusion, I keep thinking of the Dragon Ball Z. You're probably not. Are you familiar with Dragon Ball Z when they do the fusion dance? Every time I think of, oh geez, I'm such a nerd. But when they do that, when they perform the fusion dance. Anyway, so the trunks fuse together. What happens after that? We take the trunks and we wire them out. Is that what we're kind of looking at? Or can you do it earlier?
You could, but if you're working with seedlings, then, usually you just are focused on getting them fused. And then once that's strong, then you can cut off whatever or wire out whatever you want to do. Yeah.
Because that's where it kind of goes from, you fuse the trunks together. Great. Now you got the clump going. Now what? It's like they all just kind of grow into this one giant, just shooting. It almost looks like a firework of just of trunks coming up. But you could go in and do all the wiring, all the nifty stuff. And usually, would Japanese maples or trident maples would they kind of grow outwards on their own? Would that be something that they would try to do, or I think Japanese maples probably grow out a little bit more, whereas tridents are more apically dominant, like crazy, like want to grow straight up, right?
Yeah, I think a young tree is going to want to go straight up as much as it can just to get height. But so you'll have to, I think, make some cuts initially to kind of direct where you want your growth to go, or maybe a few wires. But I don't think you would need to do any super hard wiring, but it'll definitely require some maintenance, which is why it's just easier to air layer.
Yeah, that's one thing. If you've got like this big giant knuckle on a tree, this is a really great way to get a clump. It doesn't have to be a broom that you're confused about and be like, oh man, this broom is insane. It's got inverse taper. It's got this ugly scar where I try to do this. I've seen some Japanese technique attempts where someone will take like a Zelkova or some elm and they'll cut that V into it, that V shape, and then they'll wrap it with the buddy tape or grafting tape, and it'll force all the buds to go straight up out of it. And sometimes if that's not checked and you don't control the number of buds flying out of that thing, it's going to swell up and just look ridiculous. And air layered off, clump, boom, instant. And then clumps could also be, you could find them in your landscape. Like if you've got a big bush that's been hedge pruned several times and over, and then you see like this big giant gnarly piece of just branches, and then you see where the branch clearly comes up as a knot. But all species are different. But usually in the spring, correct? Like later spring, we could start peeling off the cambium.
Yeah, you'll see like suckers coming up around like a stump or an old knotted trunk in your yard or whatever.
Yeah, ground layer and air layer, everything in your yard that you think is interesting, and make clumps out of them. It's easier than you would think. But yeah, there was actually a clump I was trying to think of just a moment ago. I can't remember what it is. Like I had a particular tree in my head, and then for some reason I went back around to that air layered elm tree that me and you and the intensives worked on. That Gatsabutsa, that's like a clump kind of thing. That was an air layer. That's a great example of that too.
Yeah, that one was air layered.
Chinese elms, but I remember one of the issues with the Chinese elm, when you air layer it, the roots are so fine that it would take a long time for it to become something that looks like Nabari or surface root, right?
Yeah.
It's not as quick as like a Japanese maple or a Trident maple could be.
Right.
So it's a great style, but it's definitely not a catch-all style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's fun. As far as bonsai styles go, I would definitely recommend, like I was saying, we'll probably dive deeper into this as we go on, as we start to discover and tease out more bonsai styles or forms. Mm-hmm. I would suggest for the listeners to go out and find Bonsai Styles of the World by Charles Ceronio. And you can find it on Amazon right now let's see, I can include a link. I don't know if link in the description of this episode.
Link in description.
There's link in the description below. No, there's you can't. You're not watching a YouTube video, so I hear a lot of those people
say
that
we're not on YouTube because those facial expressions I make are just ridiculous.
Don't worry. Someday
we'll be on YouTube.
One day we'll do a YouTube thing where we both, or all three of us, get the nerve to get good cameras and maybe intentionally like something like I would want to do like a green screen or something. I don't know. Nobody wants to see my dirty man cave office thing that I got going on here. But go to the link. I'm going to throw it in there so it's easy to find. I'm seeing paperback options are not very well. That's not a good link because then two people would be able to buy 2 used copies of this book. But if I find a source for it, I will make sure to link it. It's a great book. And it can kind of
I'll have to see if it's here in the library because I should read that.
I mean, it's not really like a adventurous like big read. It doesn't have it has a lot more images and drawings. Mm-hmm. So it's a good source to be like, what is this tree? Flip through this book. Oh wait, this kind of looks like this. Oh, it just so happens to be like this species. So then we kind of hone in and start styling it towards that style. It makes the pre-bonsai or the raw stock approach not seem so intimidating, mm-hmm. Which is a whole other topic on its own of selecting raw stock or pre-bonsai material, mm-hmm. Which would be fun for maybe next time. But mm-hmm. But yeah, let's move on to the bonsai word of the week. And I chose mame. I hear mame a lot, and it is one of the several distinct bonsai size classification words. And Carmen, why do you think bonsai size classification words and all that is important?
I think the biggest application for it is in a bonsai show to distinguish categories of trees so that you're not judging something that's, a mame, which is 4 inches, mm-hmm. With something that's, 3 feet tall. So they get to be in their own category, just so that you're not, having, because sometimes when you're growing something really small, you're looking for different things than something that's really big. So,
and I adore mame, and a lot of people adore bonsai. Mm-hmm. Mame. It is. I mean, it really kind of exemplifies the little things for bonsai. Like this is like the littlest of little things for bonsai. Yeah. Now this is where it gets really. I think it's really awesome. Is the word mame literally means bean.
It means bean? I didn't know that. I love that.
Isn't that awesome? It just means bean size.
Bean size.
Yeah. So something that to be held very easily. So mame.
I held a $300 mame maple in my hand once. It was the tiniest thing, and it was just very expensive. And I was like, really?
it was
very small.
It was very quote unquote expensive. You were like, man, this feels expensive. And there's a couple of things that can make mame feel old or valuable like that. And that's going to come from technique and development, obviously. And sometimes the containers, oh my gosh, some of the containers they're so elaborate, because with mame trees, the bonsai potter doesn't have to make such a big pot. So instead of like really big containers are normally just glazed or they're unglazed. And if you find a big bonsai pot with details like hand painted stuff or hand carved, then the price of that pot's going to just be so over the top, right? And because they have to put all the extra time into it. Whereas a mame or a shohin, which is the next size up, those little pots, they don't have to do so much. So I've seen one of my favorite styles of little shohin or mame pots is like the Wedding of the Fox or Mr. Fox's wedding style pots. They're just so awesome. It makes me think of
Fantastic Mr. Fox.
Fantastic Mr. Fox, yeah. It's such an adorable like little design. It's on a little tiny pot. And so, yeah, you can get these little tiny intricate designs, or you can get something that's so minimalistic. We're already so minimalistic in bonsai sometimes, and this really takes it to the next level of minimalistic. So I think the height requirement of mame is, I think it's right at 4 inches, which
I think so.
In all honesty, 4 inches is still like a decent size. It's not tiny. And I know there's another classification of smaller bonsai that I've heard. What was that?
Mini beans? What do you even call them?
There's the micro bonsai. Micro mame. Micro beans. I think they're just, I was going to type in micro bonsai, but I typed in micro beans on accident. Micro bonsai name. I don't think there's any other names for that, because once it gets mame, because mame specifies 4 inches and under. So I think once it gets to a certain size, like it gets so small, if you're looking at it through like a telescope, I think you're going a little too small. But
that might be too small.
I've seen micros where like there's this one guy, I can't remember if it was in a bonsai documentary. I can't remember the name of the documentary, of course, but if I remember it later on, I can try to tell y'all. It was on YouTube. It was like I think it was a BBC network where this guy, he was taking these little pieces of clay and he was taking a toothpick and he's making micro mame trees that were so small that like a literal grain of rice would like fit into the pot perfectly.
Oh my God. What kind of tree was he even using?
They're like little pieces of basically like fern or lichen or moss.
They looked like little micro bonsai, but they weren't actually technically. They were bonsai.
But it's technically bonsai though, because you're keeping like a little tiny plant that looks like a big tree, but it's a little tiny tree. Of course, in mome bonsai or bean bonsai, your proportions are so small, and so there's very little room for error in your design and very little room for error in your care of these little guys. So
if you miss a pruning, it's over. Grow it into the next size.
Oh crap!
Your mame suddenly becomes shohin.
Yeah, and I always joke about the subclassifications of all these small trees, because I hear that like a lot of in a lot of bonsai shows, when they judge the categories of bonsai sizes, they are like shohin. If you do mame, it's still technically shohin. They don't really want to go that tiny. And the next one is kifushu, which is the ones up to 12 inches to 14 inches.
So yeah.
And then you go up to, do you know what the next one is?
I think it's shuhin, which is the next, it's like 12 to 18 inches, I think.
Yeah. In the terms and the classifications have varied over the years too, I've heard. But there is like a shuhin, which I think you said, but maybe that's different. There's the
No, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
It's the Chuhin is the one that's up to 8 inches or something, because a Shohin is up to 8 inches technically, but because of the way that bonsai is developed, they get fatter and fatter. And then the Chuhin or the Chuhin go up to 10 inches. I mean, it's gotten so like,
okay. Yeah,
we're
Kifu,
like,
aren't Kifu and Chuhin
basically the same thing.
Okay.
They're like the very fine line drawn between those two sizes.
Yeah, they're like, it's a little too big for Shohin, but you might show it and then have like a Shohin as your accent.
Mm-hmm. And I always joke whenever I'm talking about these size classifications when they get to this point. I always tell people like the best way to think about it is that a Chuhin from Shohin to Chuhin is a Texas size Shohin. So it's just a little bit bigger. It should be.
Story once of when like Bjorn went to Texas or something and they were doing Shohin or Chuhin. I don't remember what they were doing, but he was like, these aren't the right size. They're like, everything's bigger in Texas.
They use I heard that they use the what is it, the bottleneck. I think I told you this earlier on. Maybe this is outside of the podcast. Something about the bottleneck of a Shiner beer is like that. That's the limit. And but anyway, yeah. I spent time in Texas last week. Was that last week?
I don't know. I think it was because it was 2 weeks ago that you were here.
And the podcast is on a week cycle, so this is the past. You're listening. All of our listeners are time travelers. And so I was in Austin for 3 or 4 days, roughly. Beautiful, beautiful bonsai over there. Lots of great selection and stuff. And yeah, I mean, the bonsai like community and clubs out there is enormous. It's so awesome.
A lot of bonsai.
Yeah, lots of good bonsai out there. But yeah, awesome, guys. Thank you so much for having me over to Austin. I remember talking to the group in San Antonio and stuff. That's going to be a good time. And maybe things will come up in Houston. I think speaking of like Mame Shohin, there is a show. Let me look at it on my phone really quick because somebody sent me a message about it a little while back. Let me see if I caught it. Yeah, it's still okay. We're still before it. So the Lone Star Bonsai Society is having one nationals last year with his juniper. What's his name?
I have no idea.
He's won the show a few times, or quite a few times in a row. Suten.
Suten. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Suten's going to be at this Shohin seminar, basically. It's going to be June 10th and 11th, and it's going to be the Lone Star group, which is just Texas. That's just Texas, like, group of bonsai clubs come together and they put on these seminars together. And they're doing a Shohin show. It's going to be awesome. A Shohin show. But, yep. And we're still doing the ABS coming up. That's coming up in a handful of months.
Yep, the weekend before the Shohin show.
Yep, there you go. If you're in the Southeast and you're just like closer to Texas than Denver, which how far is it? Denver's a good ways out there.
Yeah.
So to give you guys an idea too, we're just kind of rambling on at this point, but whatever. I'm in Louisiana. I'm in Southeast Louisiana, and Denver is 20 hours from me.
Is it really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh!
It's dead center in the middle of Colorado. It's literally central Colorado.
I forget how big this country is sometimes.
Like you're in the Pacific Northwest right now, and
I drove across the country like 2 years ago, and I'm like, I don't know how big the country is.
Whoops, because like. Up where you're at, there's like alpine, like Cascade species, and then you're in the Midwest, like usually, and there's I don't know what y'all's range is more like, but that's more like. So I think even from the Pacific Northwest, that drive. Are you going to drive or fly to that? I'm just
to Colorado.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to fly. There's no way I can drive that.
I don't know how far it is.
The fact that I'm leaving for 2 weekends in a row in the spring is already
is already a lot.
Already a lot.
But yeah. But yeah, those shows are coming up. Make sure you guys check them out. I know we've talked about them, but good to keep mentioning them, especially for the North American range. I'm sorry to the listeners that I'm not very familiar with your parts of what's going on. And maybe it would be interesting if you've listened this far into the episode. Thank you so much. I know we're kind of meandering around, but I think for those who have listened this far in and you're paying attention to us talking about shows, if there's a show happening in your part of the world that you feel like the bonsai community should know about, and that would be interesting for more people who are getting into bonsai could go to, and it's accessible, mention it.
Yeah, let us know. I want to know.
Yeah, email me or drop it in the comments at the Patreon page. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to subscribe to our Patreon, but it'd be great. But you can subscribe to our Patreon to leave a comment and help the show grow, and we'll help your community grow by mentioning the show. We'll talk about it in detail, say when it is, where it's at. That would be really cool. I think that would be a great little thing to throw really in. But yeah, if you're not a paying Patreon and you want to just send it to me, evan@underhillbonsai.com, and we'll talk about it. But yeah, this was a good one. This is a good time. I love talking about forms and really picking apart all the different specifications that make this style, each style what it is. Because bonsai, getting into it is like you're getting just a peek.
Yeah.
Of what it could be.
Yeah, it can be
so much out there.
So complicated. And it's so funny because like I didn't think that much about all the different kinds of clumps and styles of clumps within, until we really started talking about it. It's like, oh wow, this is really broad.
It's a lot more intricate.
There's a lot more intricacies to it than you think, than just looking at a tree and going, oh, it's a clump.
Yeah. Then you can wow your bonsai friends. You're like, oh, this is a clump style, and it's got all the connected trunks come out of like a round tortoise, or this one is like a raft that fused together so much. And I mean, it's great to go. I'm sorry for the it was like a weird professor. Or like
okay, we're bonsai nerds.
like a guy from like noir, like mafia boss voice there just for a second. But anyway, but yeah, before we get too crazy and too late into this recording, or too late, it's already happened. Yeah, thanks for hanging out, Carmen, and we will catch up in the next one. I think. We'll try to do a guest. I'm hoping we can get a guest on. I don't know who yet. I know Mike just did the one with Sammy. That was a really cool one. It's cool to hear bonsai from other parts of the world. Like I said, if there's other things going on, please let us know.
I want to hear about Mike's trip. Maybe we can get him to divulge.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, we can feature Mike again, get one of our co-hosts back together with us three. It's tough coordinating us all together.
Being in 3 different time zones really makes it tricky.
Yeah, but... yeah, we'll figure it out one day. Yeah. But okay. Well, thanks for listening, Bonsai Buds. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye.